The light was wrong. Sergeant Dara Okafor noticed it first. The way the bioluminescent moss on the walls of Threshold Station pulsed in patterns that had nothing to do with the station's power grid. 23 years she'd been working containment ops for the Bureau of Xeno-Paranormal Research and Defense, and she had learned that when the light was wrong, something very old was waking up. She'd also learned that calling it in was usually a formality. The Bureau would already know. The Bureau always knew. That was the point. What the Bureau did not always know was what to do about it. "You sure about this?" said Corporal Yemi Adeyemi, 18 months out of the academy, and still carrying that particular shine that field work hadn't scraped off yet. He was watching the feed from the lower tunnels on the station's monitor wall, where the moss had started throbbing a deep and rhythmic violet, the color of a bruise fresh forming. Because the last 3 teams they sent to Kessler Station never, I know about Kessler, came back. I was going to say they never came back. I know, Yemi. She pulled her kit together the way she always did, methodical, unhurried, each piece of gear checked twice, and not because the manual said so, but because her first field mentor, a man named Vasev who'd retired to beekeeping on Europa, had told her that the ritual of preparation was the last thing you owned before a situation owned you. She was a believer. She checked her suppression rods, her spectral anchors, the small glass vial of consecrated solvent she'd been carrying since the Harkon incident 3 years ago, and never once needed to use. She checked her sidearm last, not because it mattered less, but because it was the one thing she was most likely to reach for, and least likely to need. What mattered on a job like this was the old knowledge, not firepower. The thing that was waking up beneath Threshold Station was not a weapon. It was not a threat in any traditional sense. It was, as best the Bureau's field lexicon could describe it, a convergence entity, something that had slept in the rock of this moon for so long that the moon's geology had started organizing itself around the entity's dreaming. The moss was part of it. The particular resonance in the walls, a low-frequency vibration that set your back teeth humming, was part of it. The body of Oliver Tresson, the station's primary contractor, and a man whose political connections had made this posting a Bureau headache for 2 years running, was almost certainly part of it now. They'd found Tresson in the lower cooling chambers, drained and folded neatly into himself like something that had been carefully taken apart and found insufficient. His expression was one of complete surprise. That was always how it was with men like Tresson. They invited things in because they thought the invitation gave them control, and they were always surprised when it didn't. The thing responsible was called Erej. The Bureau's Xenoarchaeology Division had a longer designation for it, a string of phonetic markers that described its taxonomy within a class of predatory convergence entities cataloged under the umbrella term bloodform. But Okafor had known it by the short name since she was 12 years old, sitting in the dark of a field kitchen on Maris 4, listening to her grandmother describe the thing that had come to their colony and stayed for a season, and taken 17 people before the old woman's own field unit had found a way to drive it back. Her grandmother had been Bureau, too. The Okafor family had been Bureau going on 4 generations, which meant they had also been, going on 4 generations, a family of people who knew things that made sleep difficult. "She's been dormant for 60 years, the briefing officer had said. Like that was reassuring. The entity was last neutralized by Marcus Solon, Okafor had said. I know. He was my grandmother's partner. The briefing officer had looked at her with that particular expression she'd learned to recognize. The half-second recalibration of a person who had just been reminded that the Bureau was not a bureaucracy but a bloodline. A lineage of the specifically stubborn. He left notes, Okafor had said. We know. We have them. I have them, too. The notes were in her coat pocket now. Not the digital copies. The physical pages, handwritten by Marcus Solon, in the meticulous script of a man who understood that digital files could be corrupted and physical pages could be held and read in the dark by the light of a dying torch. He'd been 24 when he first encountered Erej, young enough to be terrified, old enough to do it anyway. She descended into the lower tunnels with Yemi behind her and 2 additional agents she'd requested and not expected to receive. A woman named Pell, who could read psychic resonance in metal structures, and a man named Caro, who had been born on a moon with a 17-hour day, and consequently had eyes that functioned significantly better in the dark than any other human eyes Okafor had ever worked alongside. The ghosts appeared on the second sublevel. That was the word for them. The Bureau's official terminology was displaced memory imprints. But Okafor had been in the field long enough to call things what they were, and what these were was ghosts. Translucent forms that moved through the walls and gathered in the corridor ahead of them with the collective urgency of something trying to deliver a message. Faces Okafor recognized from the missing persons reports. 17 people, the same number as Maris 4. Leave, they said, in that way that imprints said things, not with sound exactly, but with a pressure in the chest, a sudden and involuntary understanding. Leave now. I know, Okafor said out loud, because she had found that imprints responded better to auditory acknowledgement than to silence. I know what she did to you. We're not leaving. We're here to finish it. The forms surged, not in aggression, but in something closer to despair. And then, in that same voiceless register, she felt what they were actually trying to communicate, and it wasn't a warning to leave. It was a warning about what Erej had already done. Tressen's blood was into the lower chambers, and someone had already started the feeding circuit. She broke into a run. The lower chambers of Threshold Station were built for cooling, vast vaulted spaces, filled with the low hum of thermal regulation systems and the smell of machine oil and recycled atmosphere. Erej had made them into something else. The walls were webbed with organic structures that hadn't been there 48 hours ago, filaments of deep violet that pulsed in the same rhythm as the moss above, that carried a faint heat Okafor could feel through her gloves. The Iron Maiden was in the center chamber. That was how Solon's notes described the containment form that blood form entities retreated to when they were wounded. They found a structure, usually metal, usually enclosed, and they reshaped it from the inside until it matched the architecture of their dormancy. The object in the center of the chamber had been a coolant storage vessel, cylindrical, 3 meters tall. Now it was something else. Now it had a face. The face was beautiful, in the specific and weaponized way that such things were always beautiful, designed to trigger the primate recognition response, to make the human nervous system hesitate before it acted, to buy precisely the half-second of paralysis that was all a blood-form entity needed. Erej was not fully reconstituted. The face was still incomplete, one cheek translucent, the jaw still half-formed from the original metal of the vessel, a thing caught between its dormant shape and its waking one. It turned toward Okafor, and its unfinished eyes found her, and even incomplete, the force of that attention hit like a physical pressure. Leave, it said, in a language that wasn't language, but that Okafor understood anyway. I remember the last one who came to face me. I remember his hands, how they shook. I will remember yours. His name was Marcus Solon, Okafor said. He got old. He asked me to say hello. She was stalling. She needed the entity's attention on her, while Pell moved to the eastern junction, and Caro took position at the western access point. She needed 20 more seconds, maybe 30, and she was going to spend them standing in the full weight of Erej's regard and not letting her face show what that felt like, which was approximately what she imagined standing in front of a supernova felt like, the sense of something so vast and so indifferent to her specifically that the only rational response was to sit down and cry. She did not sit down and cry. That had never been the Okafor family's way. Around her, the filament structures in the walls pulsed faster. The entity was feeding from the residue of Tressen's blood, drawing itself back together. And she could watch the jaw solidifying in real time, could watch the partial vacancy of that translucent cheek filling in. She was running out of time. Do you know what you are? Erej said, and its voice was fully formed now even if its body wasn't, a sound like water over stone, like something very old speaking a language it had invented. You are a mayfly. You are a spark. In 60 years I have dreamed of things that outlasted your entire civilization's memory. In 60 years I have. Pell, Okafor said. The spectral anchor detonated in the eastern junction with a crack that shook the chamber and sent a cascade of violet light across every filament in the room. Erej screamed, not in pain, not yet, but in something older than pain, the sound a dreaming thing makes when it is interrupted mid-dream. Okafor moved. She'd rehearsed this moment in her head so many times that it had taken on the quality of memory rather than anticipation, as if she had already done it, and was only now catching up to herself. She crossed the chamber floor at a sprint, pulled the glass vial from her coat pocket, cracked the seal with her thumb, in the way Solon's notes had described, 2 rotations counterclockwise, sharp downward pressure, and drove the contents into the base of the iron vessel before Erej's reconstituting hands could catch her. The consecrated solvent hit the feeding circuit. The effect was not explosive. It was not dramatic in any visual sense. What happened was this. The violet light in the filament structures stopped pulsing and simply went out, all of it at once, like a thought extinguished. Erej made a sound that Okafor would spend several subsequent years trying not to hear in her dreams, a long descending tone, something between a frequency and a grief, the sound of a thing that had been old when the moon was young, finally being shown that it was not indestructible. The entity collapsed inward, not violently, with a kind of dignity actually, which Okafor had not expected, as if even in its ending it was choosing how to end. The face was the last thing to dissolve, and for a moment, just a moment, the expression on it was something other than predatory, something almost human. Surprise again, but this time a different kind. "I told you," Okafor said quietly, to no one in particular and to everyone who needed to hear it, "we weren't leaving. It took 3 hours to clear the station." The ghosts departed as Erej's structure dissolved, the imprints finally freed from whatever gravitational pull the entity had kept on the memories of its victims. They went quietly, the way the dead go when something is finally finished. Okafor watched the last of them, a man about Yemi's age, who had probably come to Threshold Station looking for advancement and found instead the specific bad luck of being in the wrong place when something old began to wake, and thought about the first thing her grandmother had ever told her about the work. "Problem with this job," her grandmother had said, "is that you never get to tell the people you saved that you saved them. You only get to tell yourself." Okafor had been 12. She hadn't understood what that meant until much later. She understood it now. Yemi found her in the upper corridor, sitting against the wall with Solon's notes in her lap. He was carrying 2 field rations and the look of a man who had just discovered that fear and exhilaration were not, in practice, as distinguishable as he'd been taught. "Pell says you should have told her about the solvent earlier," he said. "She says she spent 15 minutes trying to calculate an alternative approach and you had the answer in your pocket the whole time." "I know. She's not wrong. She's not." Yemi sat down against the wall beside her. He opened both rations, handed her one. It was a gesture she recognized. The small human language of shared discomfort, of 2 people on the wrong side of a difficult night deciding together that it was over. She had seen that gesture in Solon's notes. He had described it exactly, sitting against the wall of a burning field kitchen on Maris 4 60 years ago, his partner handing him a field ration, and neither of them saying anything for a long time. Some gestures were very old, too. Just a different kind of old. "What was it like," Yemi said, "standing in front of it, when it looked at you?" Okafor thought about how to answer honestly without making him afraid of the next time. She thought about what it had actually felt like. The pressure, the sense of infinite scale, the particular loneliness of a small, warm thing in front of something cold and ancient and vast. "Like standing at the edge of a very deep canyon," she said finally, "and looking down, and then looking up, and deciding the sky is more interesting." Yemi considered this. "That's either very zen," he said, "or you're terrible at describing things." "Both," she said. "Probably both." She looked down at Solon's notes, at the careful, measured handwriting of a 24-year-old who had survived something that should have killed him and then gone back to doing it again for the next 40 years. At the marginalia he'd added much later, when he was older, in a different ink. Annotations and clarifications, and in one case a small sketch of a beehive that had nothing to do with the notes and everything to do with the man who made them. She folded the pages and put them back in her coat pocket. Outside the station, the moon's rotation had brought the system's primary sun up over the horizon, and the light came through the observation ports at a long angle, amber and warm, filling the corridor. The moss on the walls had gone dark. The station hummed with its own machinery, clean and functional, doing the work it was built to do. No more wrong light. Okafor ate her ration. Yemi ate his. For a while, neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of language, its own kind of complete. The debrief took 4 days. That was standard for a Class FOI convergence event, and Okafor had been through enough of them to treat the debrief as its own kind of ritual. The careful reconstruction of what had happened in a sequence that the Bureau could archive and learn from, and eventually teach to someone like Yemi, who would one day be sitting in this room briefing someone younger than himself. She told them about the filaments. She told them about the timing of the solvent deployment, the 2-rotation counterclockwise seal break, the importance of disrupting the feeding circuit before full reconstitution rather than after. She told them about the ghosts, the imprints, and what they had actually been trying to communicate because in her experience, the Bureau's official position on imprints was too focused on what they said and not focused enough on the distinction between what they said and what they meant. They weren't warning us off, she said. They were warning us that the blood was already in the circuit. They'd been trying to tell someone that for 48 hours, and no one had listened because everyone assumed displaced memory imprints were operating out of residual fear. They weren't. They were operating out of something much more coherent than that. Memory imprints don't demonstrate purposive communication, said the senior analyst. He said it the way people said things that they'd been told were true and had subsequently stopped examining. This one did, Okafor said. All 17 of them, simultaneously. Coordinated. That would suggest an unprecedented level of, yes, she said, it would. She put Solon's notes on the table. He documented it too, she said. Maris 4 60 years ago. He described the same thing, and your predecessors filed it under anomalous behavior and moved on. I'm asking you not to do that again. The room was quiet for a moment. What do you think it means? Said Yemi, who was sitting at the back of the room in the non-essential personnel chairs and clearly feeling the freedom of having nothing to prove. She thought about what it meant. About 17 people who had been taken and killed and should have been nothing more than residual static in the walls, but who had instead organized themselves around a purpose, who had held together, held a coherent message, held a resolve that should by any technical definition have been beyond their capacity. I think, she said, that people don't stop being people just because they're gone. I think they were protecting the next ones. I think that's what people do. Nobody wrote that down. It wasn't the kind of thing that went into bureau reports. But Yemi wrote it down. She saw him. Marcus Solon was 111 years old, living in a small habitat on Europa between extensive fields of hexagonal cultivation frames, where he kept 17 distinct colonies of terrestrial bees. The bees had no evolutionary context for Europa and were deeply confused about the light levels and the gravity, and they compensated by being extremely productive. Solon found this philosophically appropriate. He was sitting in his sun chair. The habitat had a directed UV array for exactly this purpose. When Okafor arrived, and he had the look of a man who had known she was coming before she'd known it herself, which was either intuition or the specific prescience that came from having been in the field long enough to read the shape of situation before they fully formed. She's done, Okafor said. She sat down in the other sun chair. Erej is gone. Solon was quiet for a moment. Good, he said, just the one word. Not triumphant, just good, the way you said it when something overdue had finally resolved. I used your notes. I know. They sent me the debrief summary. He glanced at her. You kept the physical copy. You kept physical copies. I was young and didn't trust technology. I trust technology fine, Okafor said. I just wanted to hold something that had been in the room with you when you were 24 and scared. Solon looked at her for a long moment. Were you scared? He asked. She thought about standing in that chamber, about the weight of Erez's attention, about the very deep canyon and the decision to look up instead of down. Yes, she said. Good, said Solon with something that wasn't exactly a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. The ones who aren't scared are the ones who get other people killed. They sat for a while in the directed UV, in the particular warmth of a light that wasn't real sunlight, but had been designed by someone who remembered what real sunlight felt like, and wanted to approximate it here at the edge of the solar system, in a habitat surrounded by ice and darkness, and the confused productiveness of 17 bee colonies trying to make sense of a world that wasn't made for them. She said she dreamed for 60 years, Okafor said. While she was dormant, she seemed to think it was an argument for her own significance. What did you say? I didn't. I was busy. Solon made the sound that old field agents made when something was both professionally sound and personally funny. What would you have said, he asked, if you'd had time? Okafor watched one of the bees, a scout probably, from the behavioral pattern, move past in a low arc between cultivation frames, performing its particular navigation by a sun it had never evolved to navigate by, finding its way anyway through pure accumulated insistence. I'd have said that 60 years is nothing, she said. My grandmother worked this job for 40 years. You've worked it for 80. The people in those walls held together for 2 days after they were already dead, specifically to protect the next group of people. Whatever she was dreaming about for 60 years, that's nothing. That Solon smiled. Really smiled this time. Your grandmother, he said, was one of the best agents this bureau ever produced. She'd tell you she was the best. She'd be wrong by a narrow margin, Solon said. Very narrow. The bee completed its arc and vanished between the frames, back toward its colony, back toward its particular collective warmth. Okafor sat in the artificial sun and let the silence be comfortable, which it was. The particular comfort of two people who had both stood in front of the same impossible thing in different decades, and were sitting here now, which meant something about the long argument humans had been making against the dark since before they knew the dark had a name. The station was repopulated 4 months later. New personnel, full psychological screening, the structural filaments fully excised and replaced with clean composite. The moss was gone. The wrong light was gone. The humming in the walls was the normal humming of functional infrastructure. Yemi was assigned to the new team which he had specifically requested, which had surprised his supervisors and not surprised Okafor at all. She went to see him off at the transit port. He had that particular look again, the one that fieldwork was supposed to scrape off, and she was genuinely glad it was still there, because she had come to understand that that look wasn't naivety. It was the specific brightness of someone who had been afraid and hadn't let it calcify into caution. Pell says to tell you that the anchor timing in the notes is wrong, he said. She's revised the protocol. Good. Send me the revision. She also says she still thinks you should have told her about the solvent earlier. She's still right. Yemi shouldered his kit, checked the latches, twice methodically, in the way she'd watched him learn to do it. He was going to be good at this. He was going to be one of the ones who came back, and came back, and came back again until he was very old, and keeping bees somewhere cold, and waiting for the next person in the line to come tell him it was done. One thing, he said, when you were in the chamber, when it was looking at you, you said you decided to look up instead of down. Yes. What were you looking up at? Okafor thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about everything, without embellishment, without the retrospective narrative that trauma liked to apply to its own surviving. The ceiling, she said, just the ceiling. There was a crack running across it, and I was thinking that the engineering team had probably noticed it, but decided it wasn't structurally significant, and I was thinking that I'd mention it in my report. And I realized that I was planning to write a report, which meant some part of me had already decided I was going to be alive to write it. And I thought, that's probably enough. That's probably the thing. Just keep planning the next thing. Yemi was quiet for a moment. That's it, he said. That's the trick? That's the trick. He nodded slowly in the way of someone filing something where they'll actually be able to find it. I'll see you when I get back, he said. Yes, she said. You will. He went through the gate. She watched him until he was gone, and then she stood in the transit port for a moment. In the ordinary light of a functional station, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of people going about the extraordinary business of living in places they were not supposed to survive, and she thought about her grandmother and about Solon in his sun chair, and about 17 people who had held themselves together for 2 days after they were dead because there was still something they needed to say. She thought about Erej, who had dreamed for 60 years in the dark, and in all of that dreaming, had apparently never once considered the possibility that the mayflies would come back, that they would always, specifically and stubbornly, come back. She took out her datapad and opened a new report. She wrote, structural crack noted in Chamber 3 ceiling. Engineering review recommended. And then she wrote the rest of it, carefully and completely, for whoever would need it next.